All right, why don't we get started? Yesterday, we were learning a halacha called ha'osek b'mitzvah, pater min mitzvah. If you're engaged in one mitzvah, you can exempt yourself from another mitzvah. And so the example we saw from the Gemara, and it was called the Pruta de Rav Yosef, the Rav Yosef's Pruta. How much would you pay to be exempt from having to go to the door to attend to a shliach who's asking for tzedakah? And that's what you get when you're engaged in the mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda. If you have to take care of Fluffy, you have to give Fluffy a bath, right? That was the example we gave, right? So then you don't have to go to the door to take care of the person who's asking for tzedakah. Okay, so this has multiple applications. Let's take a look at a practical application before we get into the halacha of Hashavas Aveda. I just wanted to show you that it has an application outside of this as well in multiple places. So if everyone can see the Shulchan Aruch over here, this is in Hilchos Tefillin in Siman Lamed Ches in the Shulchan Aruch in Orach Chaim, which is from, and we'll look at the Mishnah Berurah in just a second. Kosvei Tefillin u'mezuzas. Can everyone see that? If a person is a scribe and he writes for a living, he writes tefillin and mezuzahs, heim v'tagrehem v'tagrei tagrehem. In other words, they, both the scribes themselves and their dealers and their dealers' dealers, v'chol ha'oskim b'meleches shamayim, and anyone else who's engaged professionally in heavenly work, meaning if your profession involves doing a mitzvah, is essentially what he's writing. Piturim mehanochas tefillin kol hayom. These people are exempt from donning tefillin the entire day. Zulas b'shas kriya shema u'tefillah, except for when you're actually davening. When you're davening, you have to put on tefillin. But if, let's say, your job requires you to do a mitzvah, let's say as a scribe, or working at a Judaica store where you're selling merchandise for mitzvah purposes, or any other kind of profession where what you're doing professionally involves a mitzvah, you are exempt from putting on tefillin for that period of time while you're working. And the only time that you have to wear tefillin is during davening. Now, understand that there used to be a practice for people to wear tefillin throughout the day, but the reason that you're exempt is because since your profession is the engagement in doing a mitzvah, you are exempt from all other mitzvahs while you're doing that work. And the Ramah adds to that, and he writes, "V'im hayu tzrichin lasos melachtan b'shas kriya shema tefillah, az peturin mikriya shema tefillah tefillin." And if, for whatever reason, you had to do your work at the time when you normally would be reciting kriya shema and shmona esrei, then you're exempt even from davening, because if you're osek b'mitzvah, you're pater from a mitzvah. D'chol ha'osek b'mitzvah pater mitzvah acheres, because when you're engaged in one mitzvah, you're exempt from another mitzvah. Now, in tzarech litroach achar ha'acheres, and that's only true if you are good. It's going to be a burden for you to have to do the other mitzvah if you've already started one mitzvah. Aval im yechol la'aso shteim ke'echas below torach. But if you're capable of doing both mitzvahs simultaneously without undue burden, ya'aseh shteim. You should try to do both. So it's a very vague kind of description. So let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah over here says v'tagrehem, and the agents or the dealers for the scribes. Av shemarvichin mizeh, and this is true even though they're making a profit from the sale of the mezuzah or the tefillin. V'dafka imikar kavanasan kedei lahamtzian limkor lemi shetzarich lahem. And the Magen Avram gives a very strong qualification, and he says that you're only patur from other mitzvahs if your primary objective is the performance of the mitzvah, to provide Judaica to people who need it. Avolim ikar kavanasam rakli histaker lo mikri osek b'mitzvah. But if your primary objective is to make a parnasa, then you're not called being osek b'mitzvah. It all depends on your attitude. If my attitude is that I'm doing this mitzvah to help other people, so then I can exempt myself from other mitzvot. But if I'm doing this so that I can make money, and my primary objective is that I really don't care so much about whether people put on tefillin or not, but I really care about feeding my family, so then that's no longer in the realm of osek b'mitzvah. Then it just becomes like any other job. The tagrehem, and the agents of the agents, hakonim min hakonim limkor al yad, meaning that you have wholesalers and you have retailers. Okay, tzrichim, he says, and then the Rama added that if there's a need to engage in the mitzvah even during davening times, you can be exempt from davening. Kagon, an example of this, shenizdamin lo kona shirotza liknos stam, that you, all of a sudden, someone comes along who wishes to purchase stam, which is Sfarim, Sifrei Torah, Tefillin, or Mezuzahs. That's an acronym. And they want to buy a pair of tefillin, for example. V'hakona rotza lifrosh bayam o b'shayara achshav. And the buyer says, I got to catch a plane, right? In other words, I can't stick around. So then, v'i efshar lo lahamtin ad sha'asofer hatagar yekayim mitzvah echas sheba'a liyado k'gon anochas tefillin o kriya shema. And they're not able to wait until the scribe says, I'd like to daven first. Can you wait? And the guy says, no, I can't wait. If you can't sell it to me now, I'm going to have to leave without tefillin. So, v'hu adin shar kol mitzvos, and this halacha applies to any other mitzvah, not just providing other people with tefillin. Al kain mutter lichto v'limkar lazeh, afal pi shal yedei zeh ya'avor zaman ha-mitzvah. He says, and therefore it is permitted to sell to this guy, even though in the course of selling him the pair of tefillin, you may lose out on the proper time for reciting Kriya Shema. He says, Va'ayin b'bir halacha. We'll see more about this in the bir halacha, which we'll get to in just a moment. So, az peturin, so then you are exempt even from davening. Umayri shikvar hischel lichtov kodem shehigia zman Kriya Shema. But what we are talking about over here is that you already had started being engaged in the writing of the tefillin or the mezuzah before it was time to daven, before it was time to recite Kriya Shema. And then, the buyer says, listen, man, please finish up because I can't wait for you to daven because my plane is leaving. So you can exempt yourself and say, okay, I'm going to finish this mezuzah, even if it means I'm going to miss out on reciting Kriya Shema in its proper time. Mishehigia hazman asur lahaschel lichtov kemo shekasav siman ayin beis if beis ken kasav Magen Avram. But if this time for reciting Kriya Shema has already arrived, then you would not be allowed to be permitted to begin writing the mezuzah. That's what the Magen Avram writes. Achen lefi ma shetziyarnu mitchila b'shem halavush hakon tzarich lavor bayoma b'shayara. The efshelo lahamtin ad shaso for your kaim Kriya Shema tefillah. He says, but using the illustration that I gave you, that the buyer won't be able to wait for you to finish davening because he's got to catch a plane. Pashat de lekuli alma mutter hasofer lasos lo melachto imhu mishar sheyishar lo zman likros. Then it would be clear that even if the time for reciting Shema has already arrived, but the sofer estimates that he'll be able to finish taking care of this customer before the time elapses, the yachol likro parsha echas mikodem yikra. then he's allowed to engage with the customer. And if he can get away with reciting just the first paragraph before he deals with the customer, that would be preferred. And the principle is the chol ha'osek b'mitzvah patur min ha'mitzvah. When you're engaged in one mitzvah, you're exempt from another mitzvah. V'dafka osek b'mitzvah kagon b'shah shuhu lovesh hatfilin o osek b'tikunei ha'aveda kagon l'shotcha l'tzarcha o la'ashiva lebe'aleha. He says, and the only time that you're exempt from a mitzvah is specifically while you're engaged in the other mitzvah. So, for example, if I'm wearing tefillin, I can exempt myself from another mitzvah. If I'm taking care of someone's, Fluffy the dog, or I'm in the middle of taking care of the blanket that I found and I want to return to its owner, so then I can exempt myself from other mitzvot. V'chol k'hai gavna. Aval b'shah shu mekayim mitzvah kagon shu kvar labush tefillin. But let's say you're already wearing tefillin, and the engagement in another mitzvah does not inhibit you from the wearing of tefillin. O shomer aveda shehi munachas kvar b'tevaso. Or if I have a lost item that I've already properly stored and it's well protected, and it's in a drawer already. V'chol k'hai gavna afal pishu makayim mitzvah einenu osek b'mitzvah. Even though I'm actively fulfilling a mitzvah by keeping it in my house, but I'm not engaged in the performance of the mitzvah physically, and therefore v'lo miftar mi mitzvah acheres al yedei zeh, and therefore you're not exempt from any other mitzvahs at that point. V'ayin b'bir halacha shebi arti yoser. I'll explain more in the bir halacha. And we'll get to the bir halach in just a second. He says, let's see, what was the Mishnah Berurah talking about? If it's necessary, if you're not able to fulfill both without undue burden, he says, Rotzelomar va'afilu im al yedei zeh lo yisbatel hamitzvah harishona. He says, look, if there's a burden to do both simultaneously, you're exempt from even starting the second mitzvah, even if the second mitzvah is arguably a more important mitzvah. But once you've started one mitzvah, you're exempt from starting a second mitzvah if it creates a burden for you. Okay, so before we go any further, let's take a look at the Bir Halacha. No, not the Bir Hagra. The Bir Halacha. Okay.
Rabbi, can I just throw a quick question in?
Sure, Ron.
We have the minhag of wearing our tefillin basically just for davening, but it seems to me from what we just learned here that if you have, let's say it's a Sunday afternoon and you have a couple of hours of a leisure and you're in your home or whatever, you should maybe be wearing, if you're not engaged in a particular mitzvah, that you should be wearing your tefillin.
Right, that was the original custom. That practice is now frowned upon by the later poskim because really tefillin requires proper focus and concentration, that a person is supposed to be aware of the sanctity of the tefillin as well, the entire time that he's wearing them. And the concern became in later centuries that people were not able to keep their focus on the tefillin. So if, let's say, you have your tefillin on and you're watching Netflix, that's not appropriate. If you have your tefillin on and you're playing a game of cards, or you're just joking around with the guys, that's not appropriate. Okay, so and that's the reason why we don't wear our tefillin during the entire day. Let me just see. I don't want to take you down a rabbit hole if I don't have to. Okay. So we'll just do the last bir halacha. Where he writes that if you have to exert yourself unduly, even if it's theoretically possible to do both, but it's going to be a burden, you're still exempt from doing the second mitzvah. And he says that this is true. I'm quoting from the Ran, and he says, and even though there are other Rishonim who are machmir, and say you do have to exert yourself to do both simultaneously, Mikol makom mashma behabais Yosef harama demaskimum lahalacha laharan. He says, but it would seem that and the Ran, and I'm not sure what that abbreviation is in the name of the Or Zarua, mitnei harayos hatsumo sheheviu lazeh, because of the many proofs that they brought for this. V'chein Hamogen Avram hevi b'shem hahagos Maimonides sheharambam v'agonim gam kein sovrim depater afilu b'yochel l'kayim shteihem. And the Rambam, basically, he's bringing a lot of proof that even if you could fulfill both mitzvahs, but it involves burden, you can exempt yourself from the second mitzvah. B'tam hadavar, what's the reason? Kasav haran lefi shekol hasha'osek b'malachto shel makom lo chiyavaso Torah litrochu l'kayim mitzvos acheras. He says essentially the way it works is that if you're already doing God's work, then God says, I exempt you from other commandments that I've given you. Afal pi she'ef shelo, even though it's possible for you to do the second mitzvah. V'lachein, and for that reason, ha'mishamer es ha'meis poter mitzvilin u'mikriya shema u'mikol ha'mitzvos. If a person, let's say, is acting as a shomer, the guy who sits at Steele's memorial with the mace, because you're not supposed to leave a corpse by itself. So such a person is exempt from putting on tefillin and from Kriya Shema and all other mitzvahs, afal pi sheyachol az l'kayim kama mitzvahs, even though he has the capability of fulfilling other mitzvahs. But basically, God says, while you're doing one mitzvah, I exempt you from other mitzvahs. V'chein hachofer kever l'meis pater mikulam. Also, a grave digger is also exempt. Afal pi shenach ma'at, even when he's on his break. Right? Shagam b'shas nocho nikra dain osek b'mitzvah. He says, because even while he's on his break, he's still engaged in the mitzvah of digging the grave. Shal yedezeh yischaze kocho lachzor v'lachpor. Because by taking a break in, a 5-minute coffee break, he can regain his strength to be able to go back and dig. So even while you're taking a break, you're engaged in the mitzvah of grave digging. And therefore, even while you're taking a short break, you can exempt yourself from having to answer the door to, let's say, someone's at the door asking for tzedakah. But if you're already wearing the tefillin, that you're not called an osek, you're not engaged in the mitzvah physically, right? It's just that you're passively wearing it. And therefore, you're not going to be lihi patir mikol ha-mitzvos, ela b'shah shalovshan, avolo achar kach. So therefore, you only are exempt while you're actually donning the tefillin, right? But not afterwards. V'chein le'inyan mishamer aveidu chemo shekosafti b'mishnah berurah, kol zem nispar medivrei haran ve'or zarua. And therefore, just because you're wearing tefillin doesn't mean you can exempt yourself from giving tzedakah. Just because you've got the lost item in your drawer and you're passively watching it doesn't mean you can exempt yourself from giving tzedakah. Umashakasav harama aval im v'chulei below torach rotzalomer she'enu mosif tircha klal b'shvil mitzvah hashniya. When the Ramah says that if you can do both of them, you should, it's when there's no added burden upon the individual. But it's the same. It's the same amount of exertion to be able to do both. Uchedarko b'mitzvah harishona yachol yidei shteihem az bevada yira latzes yidei shteihem. He says, if you can certainly fulfill both with the same amount of exertion, so then you certainly should. Dimihiyos tov al yikore ra. Because as the Ran says from the pasuk, if you have the opportunity to be good, why would you want to be called bad? Ken kasef haran sham, o meharaya shehevi sham al ze mehagmar mashma dechiyuva hu mitzad hadin, dilav hachilo makshi hagmar shamidi va'ayin. And it seems like not only are you permitted to engage in the second mitzvah, but you're obligated to engage in the second mitzvah. So, let me just, some examples that may be real life examples. My parents are coming in from the airport, and I have a mitzvah of honoring my parents. But by picking up my parents from the airport, I'm going to have to miss going davening at a minyan. So clearly, osek b'mitzvah pater min mitzvah. I can exempt myself from the mitzvah of davening with a minyan. If, for example, my child or my grandchild needs my assistance in learning, in being able to finish his Gemara homework, and in helping my child or my grandchild do his homework, it's going to take me away from going to minyan, or it's going to take me away from some other mitzvah that I could fulfill. So then I can exempt myself if I've already started working with my son or grandson. Okay, so there are a number of applications to this, and one has to carefully weigh which mitzvah takes priority. If both mitzvahs are there before you, then it sounds like you have the opportunity to choose which one you wish to start, even if it will preclude you from doing the other mitzvah. The only thing that the poskim do point out, if one is a mitzvah overes and the other one is not a mitzvah overes. Now, what do I mean by a mitzvah overes? What I mean is that one mitzvah has a time expiration and the other mitzvah has no expiration date. So then you should do the mitzvah that has the expiration date and defer the mitzvah that has no expiration date. But that's, of course, assuming that you're going to be able to do both. But if, let's say, you have limited time and you're only going to be able to do one of them, so then you have to weigh carefully which one you're going to do and which one you're not going to do. Okay, so I wanted you to see that as just a cursory view of that. So now we can go into the text of the Imrei Yaakov. Okay. So, uminayin shehu chayav lihishtadel b'takanas ha'aveda. So, first, the Rav Shulchan Aruch quotes a pasuk, and he says, "How do we know that while you're watching the lost object, you are obligated to ensure that it is protected and that it is cared for, and that it doesn't get damaged or lose its value while it's in your possession?" Shenemar v'hashevo solo, because the Torah says you shall return it to him, meaning return the lost item to the owner. Re'ei shetashiv lo b'shleimus, and the language implies that you have to return it in its original state to its owner, meaning you have to watch over its well-being. V'chol sha'a shehu osek b'takanas ha'aveda, and based on that there's a mitzvah to protect the integrity of the lost item. So as long as you're engaged in that effort, hareza osek b'mitzvah, you're engaged in the performance of a mitzvah. Upatr militain pas la'ani umisha'ar mitzvahs. You would therefore be exempt from giving bread to the poor man, right? In other words, if someone says, I'm looking for a meal, you say, I'm sorry, listen, you'll have to go to the guy next door. I'm involved in Hashavas Aveda right now. I can't help you. I'm giving Fluffy a bath. And you can exempt yourself from other mitzvahs as well. Uchederach sha'amru ba'aveda, Kach Amru, and well, a lot of commentary. Just like this is true by Hashavas Aveda, that by being engaged in that mitzvah, you can exempt yourself from other mitzvahs. They said the same thing Bifi Kadon, Shahochu Ba'alav Lemedina Sayam. That let's say someone leaves with you. It's not a lost item per se, but someone leaves an object of value that belongs to them, and they ask you to watch over it. So your friend goes to Israel, and he asks you to take care of Fluffy, right? And so that's a pikadon. That's an object of value that your friend leaves with you to watch over. Okay, shechayav hanifkad lihitasek b'takanat pikadon kederach shemitasek ba'aveda. That you have to watch over and maintain the integrity of that object, just as if it was a lost item that you have to watch over and maintain. He says the only difference, says the Rav Shulchan Aruch, between a lost object and an object that was given to you for safekeeping is sha'ach she'eno rashai l'machro mipnei hefsid ha'asid lavo. The difference is that with a lost item that you are trying to find the owner to return it to the owner, so there, if you feel that it may depreciate in value, you're allowed to sell it well in advance of its depreciation. Kegon chametz lifnei haPesach shim yamtin l'mocher shach hamishis be'erev Pesach yimkerenu bezol ma'od. So he says an example of this is, let's say you find a whole cartload of chametz, and you know it belongs to a Jew because it has, it's in their the Heimische brand of kosher cookies, and you find a whole pallet of those cookies, and you're trying to find who the owner is. And it happens to be that while you are storing it in your house and trying to track down the owner, it turns out that Pesach is coming. And if you keep these in your possession for too long, they're going to lose their value because no one's going to want to buy a pallet of cookies right before Pesach. So therefore, if you're engaged in the mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda for this pallet of cookies, you're allowed to sell it a couple of weeks before Pesach, and with the argument that if I wait any longer, then they're going to depreciate in value and I won't be able to find a buyer unless I really unload them on the cheap. Okay, uvaveda be'inyan zeh, mochra mitchila kedei sheyimkar biyoker. So with a lost object in that kind of scenario, you're allowed to sell them a couple of weeks before Pesach so that people will still buy them at market value. Aval bepikadon yamtin ad sha'ach hamishis shema yavo ba'alav yikachenu. But if someone left you a pallet of cookies for safekeeping, then you don't have permission to sell it off until they come back for it. Unless it's mamish right before, it's like on Erev Pesach, and you have to get rid of it, then you can sell it to a Gentile at the very last minute, right? And the reason is because since the guy gave it to you for safekeeping, you know who the owner is, and he may come to retrieve the item at any moment. V'chein kol kayotze bazeh. And this example would hold true in other instances as well. Okay, so I want to get back to this issue of osek b'mitzvah patur min mitzvah, and then we'll look at these other details as well. But at least we were able to read the halacha in the Rav Shulchan Aruch, and then Mirz Hashem next week we'll go into the commentaries. Okay, so let me wish you all a good Shabbos, and it's nice to see